The fatal mistake. Why being nice is destroying you. You were told your entire life that being nice would protect you. Be patient. Be understanding. Be the bigger person. Stay calm. Don't escalate. Don't make waves. If you do that long enough, people will eventually meet you with the same decency you give them. And yet here you are, confused, drained, second-guessing yourself, wondering how someone you tried so hard to love somehow walked away with your confidence, your peace, and your sense of reality, while you're left asking, what did I do wrong? Here's the truth most people never want to say out loud. Being nice is exactly how you lost. Not because kindness is wrong, but because you used it in a place where kindness is not understood as goodness. It's understood as weakness. When you're dealing with a narcissist, niceness is not interpreted as maturity or empathy. It's interpreted as permission. Permission to push a little further. Permission to ignore your discomfort. Permission to test how much of yourself you're willing to give up just to keep the peace. At first, it feels noble. You explain instead of confronting. You forgive instead of holding accountable. You give them the benefit of the doubt instead of trusting your instincts. You tell yourself you're being emotionally intelligent. But slowly, something dangerous happens. You begin shrinking. Your needs feel too much. Your boundaries feel unfair. Your anger feels wrong. And the more reasonable you become, the more unreasonable the situation gets. That's the trap. You assume you're in a relationship built on mutual respect. They're operating in a system built on power. You think the goal is understanding. Their goal is control. And every time you choose niceness over self-respect, you unknowingly reinforce the very dynamic that's destroying you. This isn't about being cruel. It's not about becoming cold or bitter. It's about realizing that niceness without self-respect is not virtue, it's self-abandonment. And narcissistic personalities are experts at exploiting people who confuse endurance with strength. If this already feels uncomfortably familiar, stay with me. Because once you see what's really happening, you can't unsee it. And that's where real freedom begins. Before we go any further, if this message resonates with you, take a second to subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support this work, and make sure you don't miss the next videos that dive even deeper into understanding narcissistic dynamics and reclaiming your power. Now, a quick question for you. Which one feels more true in your life right now? A. Being nice has made things more peaceful. E. Being nice has made you feel smaller. Comment A or B below. I read them, and your answer matters more than you think. 2 games, 2 rulebooks. You are not playing the same game. At some point, usually in the quiet moments after another circular argument, you start to feel something is fundamentally off. Not just wrong, but misaligned. You replay the conversation in your head, and it doesn't add up. You were calm. You were fair. You listened. You chose your words carefully. And still, somehow, you walked away feeling disoriented, diminished, and strangely at fault. That feeling isn't accidental. You believe you are participating in a relationship governed by shared rules, rules most emotionally healthy people live by. If there's a problem, you talk it through. If someone is hurt, you acknowledge it. If a boundary is crossed, you course correct. The underlying assumption is simple. Both people want resolution. Both people want truth. Both people want the relationship to work. But the person you're dealing with is not operating under those rules. While you are trying to understand, they are trying to position. While you are clarifying, they are measuring leverage. While you believe the conversation is about what happened, they are focused on who has the upper hand. This is why nothing ever feels settled. You think the goal of disagreement is resolution. For them, the goal is dominance. You think fairness matters. They think outcomes matter, specifically outcomes that reinforce control. You are playing a game where honesty is currency. They are playing a game where emotional impact is currency. And here's the most destabilizing part. They never tell you the rules have changed. So you keep trying harder. You refine your language. You bring more evidence. You slow down. You soften your tone. You assume the misunderstanding must be yours, because surely no one would intentionally distort reality just to stay on top. But this isn't a misunderstanding. It's asymmetric engagement. You are bringing empathy into a system that rewards manipulation. You are offering vulnerability to someone who sees it as exploitable data. And every time you expect mutuality from someone who is wired for hierarchy, you end up blaming yourself for the inevitable failure. Once you see this clearly, something profound shifts. You stop internalizing the chaos. You stop believing that the solution is one more conversation, one more explanation, one more appeal to reason. You realize that your confusion was never a sign of poor communication, it was a signal that you were playing the wrong game. And when you finally recognize that there are two rulebooks in play, you gain the power to stop participating in one that was designed for you to lose. Inside the narcissistic mind, fragile ego, ruthless strategy. To understand why logic never reaches them, you have to stop looking at their behavior and start looking at what it's protecting. From the outside, a narcissist often appears confident, even dominant. They speak with certainty. They correct you quickly. They rarely hesitate. But that surface strength is deceptive. What you are actually dealing with is not a strong ego, it's a fragile one, propped up by constant defense and ruthless strategy. At the core of the narcissistic mind is a terrifying vulnerability they cannot afford to feel. Shame is not uncomfortable to them, it is annihilating. Being wrong does not feel like a mistake. It feels like collapse. Equality does not feel fair. It feels dangerous. So their entire psychological structure is built around preventing that inner exposure at any cost. This is why they cannot self-reflect in the way you expect. Reflection requires tolerating discomfort without externalizing it. Narcissists cannot do that consistently. Instead, they offload discomfort onto others. If they feel inadequate, someone else must be made smaller. If they feel threatened, someone else must be controlled. If they feel exposed, reality itself must be rewritten. Control, then, is not a preference. It's a survival mechanism. Rather than developing a stable sense of self from within, the narcissist constructs identity externally. Attention, admiration, fear, emotional reactions. These become the scaffolding that holds them together. Without those inputs, they feel hollow, unstable, unreal. This is why indifference from you feels so intolerable to them. It removes the mirror they rely on to exist. Their strategy is often unconscious, but highly consistent. They test. They provoke. They escalate. They retreat. They charm. They punish. Each move is calibrated not for closeness, but for regulation, regulating their inner chaos by controlling the emotional environment around them. This is also why accountability is so rare. Accountability would require them to sit with guilt without deflecting it, to admit harm without immediately justifying it, to see you as separate rather than subordinate. That level of internal strength is precisely what they lack. Understanding this can be unsettling, because it removes the illusion that if you just loved better, communicated better, or endured longer, something would change. It won't. Not because you failed, but because the system you're engaging with is not designed for mutual growth. And here is the crucial distinction. Understanding their inner fragility is not an invitation to save them. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. Insight does not demand continued exposure. When you truly grasp what is driving them, you stop personalizing their behavior, and that is the moment you begin to step out of its gravitational pull. Clarity, not confrontation, is what loosens their hold. The hidden weapons. How narcissists maintain control. The most dangerous forms of control are rarely obvious. If they were loud and unmistakable from the start, you would have left early. Instead, narcissistic control works quietly, accumulating power through psychological pressure rather than force. By the time you sense something is wrong, you are already reacting instead of choosing. One of the first weapons is distortion. Not an outright lie at first, but a subtle bending of reality. Events are reframed. Tone is questioned. Intent is reinterpreted. You remember what was said clearly, yet somehow you find yourself defending your memory instead of addressing the issue. This is not accidental. When your confidence in your own perception weakens, dependence strengthens. If you cannot trust your reality, you are easier to guide. Then comes reversal. The very traits that disturb you begin appearing as accusations aimed at you. If they were dismissive, you're called insensitive. If they were dishonest, you're accused of exaggerating. This reversal is not meant to convince you intellectually. It is meant to exhaust you emotionally. When you are busy defending yourself, you are no longer examining them. Another weapon is unpredictability. Periods of warmth are followed by withdrawal. Affection appears just long enough to restore hope, then vanishes without explanation. Your nervous system adapts to this rhythm. You stop asking whether the relationship is healthy and start asking what version of them you'll get today. This is not love fluctuating. It is reinforcement engineered to keep you invested. Conflict itself becomes a tool. Arguments spiral, not because the issue is complex, but because clarity would end the engagement. Topics shift. Old grievances resurface. The conversation drifts until you're no longer sure what you were addressing in the first place, and by the end, you feel drained while they seem oddly composed. That imbalance is the point. Exhaustion creates compliance. There is also performance. They may appear remorseful, wounded, or misunderstood at precisely the moments when you begin pulling away. This vulnerability feels real because it often is emotional, but it is not accountable. It does not lead to sustained change. It leads to re-engagement. Control does not require cruelty at all times. Sometimes it only requires hope. What makes these tactics so effective is that none of them feel overtly malicious in isolation. Taken together, they form a system that keeps you questioning, waiting, adjusting. The goal is not your happiness or your understanding. The goal is continued access to your emotional energy. Recognizing these patterns is not about becoming suspicious of everyone. It is about reclaiming clarity. Once you see that these behaviors function together, you stop responding to each one as a separate incident. You stop explaining them away. You stop asking what you could have done differently. And in that moment, the weapons begin to lose their edge because control depends on confusion, and confusion cannot survive awareness. The approval trap. How niceness becomes a chain. The approval trap doesn't announce itself loudly. It slips in quietly, disguising itself as loyalty, patience, and emotional intelligence. You don't wake up one day deciding to seek permission to exist. It happens gradually, through a series of small internal adjustments that feel reasonable at the time. You start paying closer attention to their moods. You anticipate what might irritate them. You choose your words more carefully, not to be kind, but to avoid consequences. You tell yourself you're being considerate, mature, understanding. But beneath that surface, something more corrosive is taking shape. Your sense of worth begins to hinge on their response. This is where niceness becomes a chain. Approval seeking is rarely obvious. It doesn't always look like trying to impress. Often, it shows up as restraint, holding back truth to keep the peace, suppressing anger to stay connected, delaying boundaries until the right moment. You wait for signs that you're doing okay. A softer tone, a moment of calm, a brief return of warmth. And when it comes, Even fleetingly, it feels like relief. That relief is the hook, because the narcissist does not experience your effort as love. They experience it as leverage. Every time you adjust yourself to avoid their disapproval, you confirm that their reactions control your behavior. Every time you wait for validation, you place your self-worth in their hands. And once that dynamic is established, respect does not follow. Control does. What makes this trap so painful is that it feeds on something deeply human. We are wired for reciprocity. When we invest emotionally, we expect acknowledgement. We believe that if someone truly sees our effort, they will eventually soften. But with a narcissist, effort is not a bridge. It's evidence. Evidence that the system is working. The goalposts move because they must. If approval were ever fully granted, the leverage would disappear. So the standard changes. What was once enough becomes insufficient. What earned calm yesterday provokes criticism today. And you are left working harder for less, convinced that the failure is yours. Here is the moment of truth that breaks the chain. Their inability to value you is not a reflection of your worth. It is a consequence of their structure. They do not relate through appreciation. They relate through dominance. When you truly understand this, the compulsion to prove yourself begins to loosen. You stop negotiating your dignity for moments of peace. You recognize that approval from someone who needs to feel superior will always come at the cost of your autonomy. And slowly, something shifts. You stop asking, "How can I get them to see me?" and start asking, "Why did I ever need them to?" That question is not bitterness. It's awakening. Stop explaining. Start observing. Patterns never lie. There comes a moment when explaining stops feeling productive and starts feeling humiliating. You realize you're not clarifying anything. You're pleading to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. And yet, you keep trying. You organize your thoughts. You present evidence. You slow your voice. You choose your words carefully, hoping precision will finally bring resolution. It never does. Explanation feels powerful because it gives the illusion of agency. It tells you that if you just communicate better, the outcome will change. But in narcissistic dynamics, explanation is not received as information, it's harvested as material. Every detail you offer becomes something that can be reframed, distorted, or later used against you. The more you explain, the more data you provide for manipulation. This is where the shift must happen. Instead of asking, "How can I make them understand?" you begin asking, "What actually happens over time?" Not what they say, not what they promise, not how convincing they sound in the moment, but what consistently follows. Patterns do not argue. They do not justify themselves. They simply repeat. You start noticing that apologies arrive only after consequences are threatened. That insight appears briefly, then vanishes. That moments of clarity are always followed by the same behaviors you were assured would never happen again. You see how confusion spikes after conversations that were meant to bring peace. You notice how you leave interactions feeling smaller, while they seem stabilized, even energized. This is not coincidence. It is information. Observation requires discipline because it removes hope from the driver's seat. It asks you to tolerate the discomfort of seeing what is, rather than clinging to what could be. And that can feel cruel at first. But clarity is not cruelty. It is respect for reality. When you stop explaining, you also stop positioning yourself as a defendant in a trial that never ends. You no longer argue your innocence. You no longer chase agreement. You allow misinterpretations to stand without correcting them, not because they are true, but because correcting them has never helped. This is not passivity. It is strategy. By shifting into observation, you reclaim your center. You are no longer pulled into every distortion. You are no longer required to respond to every provocation. You begin gathering evidence, not to convince them, but to inform yourself. And something subtle but powerful happens. Your nervous system calms. The urgency to fix fades. The compulsion to persuade dissolves. You begin trusting what you see more than what you're told. Patterns never lie. People do, sometimes intentionally, sometimes reflexively. But patterns reveal the structure beneath the story. And once you see that structure clearly, you no longer need explanation to grant yourself permission to step away from what harms you. Clarity becomes your compass. And for the first time, it points somewhere that feels steady. Emotional detachment. The moment power shifts. There is a precise moment when the balance of power begins to shift, and it has nothing to do with winning an argument or exposing the truth. It happens quietly, internally, when you stop allowing someone else to govern your emotional state. That moment is emotional detachment, and it is far more radical than it sounds. Detachment is often misunderstood. People confuse it with coldness, indifference, or shutting down. But what's actually happening is discipline. You are no longer handing your nervous system to someone who thrives on dysregulation. You are no longer letting their tone dictate your mood, their accusations dictate your self-image, or their approval dictate your sense of worth. For a narcissistic dynamic to function, your reaction is essential. Your anger, your sadness, your explanations, your visible distress, all of it signals engagement. Engagement means relevance. Relevance means control. When you react, they feel anchored. When you defend, they feel validated. When you hurt, they feel powerful. Emotional detachment interrupts that circuit. At first, it feels unnatural. Your body is used to bracing, responding, preparing for impact. When you stop reacting, there is a strange emptiness, almost like withdrawal. You may feel guilt. You may feel anxiety. You may even feel cruel for not stepping in to smooth things over. That discomfort is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign the old conditioning is loosening its grip. Detachment does not mean you deny your emotions. It means you stop expressing them where they will be weaponized. You process privately, safely, rather than in front of someone who feeds on your vulnerability. You begin choosing silence not as punishment, but as self-preservation. This is where indifference begins to emerge, not apathy, but neutrality. You listen without absorbing. You respond without defending. You disengage without dramatizing. And something remarkable happens. The provocations intensify briefly, then lose their force. Without emotional feedback, the tactics stop working. For the first time, you are not managing them. You are managing yourself. And that is the point where power quietly returns to you. Not because they change, but because you do. You stop orbiting their chaos. You stop participating in the emotional theater. You become steady in a space that once felt volatile. Emotional detachment is not a wall. It is a boundary within. It allows you to see clearly, think calmly, and act intentionally. And once you reach that place, you realize something profound. The power they once held over you was never inherent. It was borrowed from your emotional availability. When you take that back, the dynamic has no choice but to change. Boundaries. Narcissists hate, and why they test them. Boundaries are where narcissistic dynamics begin to fracture. Not because boundaries are cruel or extreme, but because they introduce something the narcissist cannot tolerate. Limits that are not negotiable. To a healthy person, a boundary is information. To a narcissist, it is a threat. This is why simply stating a boundary is never enough. You may say, calmly and clearly, what you will no longer tolerate. You may explain your reasons. You may even soften your tone to show goodwill. And yet, nothing changes. In fact, things often get worse. The disrespect escalates. The guilt intensifies. The manipulation becomes more aggressive. This reaction confuses many people, but it follows a predictable psychological logic. Narcissists do not experience boundaries as expressions of self-respect. They experience them as challenges to dominance. A boundary signals that access to you is no longer guaranteed, and that uncertainty destabilizes the control they rely on. So they test, they push, they provoke, they search for the breaking point. This is why half measures fail. If a boundary is announced but not enforced, it teaches the narcissist something critical. Your limits are performative. That, with enough pressure, enough guilt, enough emotional chaos, you will retreat. And once that lesson is learned, the behavior does not stop. It intensifies. Real boundaries are not arguments. They are actions. They do not require repeated explanations or moral appeals. They require consistency. If you say you will leave a conversation when it becomes disrespectful, you leave. If you say you will not engage in certain dynamics, you disengage. The follow-through is the boundary, not the words. When boundaries are first enforced, a phenomenon often occurs that feels alarming: escalation. The narcissist may become angrier, more manipulative, more desperate. This is not proof that you are wrong. It is proof that the old tactics are failing. Psychologically, this is known as an extinction burst, a last attempt to regain control when a previously effective strategy no longer works. This stage is where many people falter. The discomfort feels unbearable. The accusations sting. The temptation to explain one last time is strong. But consistency here is crucial. Each time you hold the line without justification or emotional reactivity, you communicate something far more powerful than words ever could. Your boundaries are real. And here is the most important shift. To understand boundaries are not about changing the narcissist. They never were. Boundaries are about changing your relationship to the behavior. They are the decision to remove yourself from what harms you, rather than waiting for harm to stop. When you fully grasp this, boundaries stop feeling like punishment and start feeling like relief. They are no longer weapons. They are acts of self-respect. And in that respect, something essential is reclaimed: your autonomy, your dignity, and your right to peace. The closure illusion. What you're waiting for will never come. There is a particular kind of hope that keeps people bound long after the damage is done. It's not the hope that things will get better. It's the hope that someday, somehow, the truth will finally be acknowledged, that they will understand, that they will take responsibility, that they will apologize in a way that feels real, that the story will end cleanly. This is the closure illusion. You replay conversations in your mind, imagining what you should have said differently. You picture the moment when they finally look at you and admit what they did. You believe that if you could just reach that moment, the pain would make sense. The confusion would settle. Your nervous system would finally rest. But that moment never arrives. Not because you failed to explain it well enough, but because closure, as you're imagining it, requires something the narcissistic psyche cannot consistently provide: accountability without control. To acknowledge your pain without reframing it as an attack, to admit wrongdoing without repositioning themselves as the victim, to validate your experience without losing dominance. That kind of closure would dismantle the very structure they rely on to feel intact. So instead, what you get are fragments. Half apologies followed by justification. Brief admissions quickly buried under blame. Moments that feel close enough to keep you waiting, but never solid enough to let you leave. Each time, you think, this time is different. And each time, the cycle resets. The longer you wait for closure from them, the longer your healing remains outsourced. What makes this so painful is that the desire for closure is deeply human. Our minds seek narrative completion. We want a clear ending. We want the story to make sense. And when someone hurts us without acknowledging it, the lack of resolution can feel like a second wound. But here is the quiet truth that changes everything. Closure was never theirs to give. Closure is not an apology. It is not recognition. It is not agreement. Closure is a decision. It is the moment you stop organizing your healing around someone else's capacity to understand you. This doesn't mean pretending the harm didn't happen. It means accepting that some people will never tell the truth in a way that frees you, and that waiting for them to do so only extends their influence over your inner world. Letting go of the closure illusion often feels like grief. You are not just releasing the person, you are releasing the fantasy of who they could have been, who you hoped they might become, and who you needed them to be for the pain to feel justified. But on the other side of that grief is something steadier. You stop waiting. You stop replaying. You stop needing the final word. And in that quiet acceptance, something unexpected happens. Your life starts moving forward again. Not because the story ended the way you wanted, but because you chose not to live inside it anymore. Do this instead. The strongest response is self-authority. There comes a point where the question is no longer how do I deal with them, but who am I choosing to be? This is the turning point most people miss. They keep searching for the perfect response, the unassailable argument, the one behavior that will finally shut the chaos down. But the strongest response to a narcissist was never a tactic directed at them. It is a decision rooted in you. That decision is self-authority. Self-authority begins the moment you stop orienting your life around someone else's reactions. You stop measuring your worth by their approval, your peace by their mood, your clarity by whether they agree with you. You recognize that no amount of explanation, endurance, or emotional labor will ever grant you sovereignty if you keep outsourcing it. This is not about becoming aggressive. It is not about retaliation, exposure, or winning. It is about reclaiming authorship over your inner world. You stop asking, how do I make them understand me? And start asking, what do I allow to shape my life? When you choose self-authority, your actions change quietly but decisively. You invest your energy where it grows instead of where it disappears. You build routines, relationships, and goals that exist independently of the narcissistic dynamic. You stop explaining your choices to people who are committed to misunderstanding them. You let your life speak for you. There is a subtle grief here. Self-authority requires letting go of the hope that someone else will finally see you clearly. It requires accepting that validation may never come from the place you once needed it most. But in that loss, something far more stable takes its place: self-recognition. You begin to trust your perceptions without needing consensus. You honor your limits without justifying them. You make decisions based on alignment rather than fear. And as this happens, the narcissistic dynamic loses relevance not because it was defeated, but because it no longer defines the terrain of your life. Thriving becomes the quiet conclusion, not as a performance, not as revenge, but as a natural consequence of no longer living in reaction. The more grounded you become, the less pull they have. The less you need them to see you, the clearer you see yourself. This is the paradox most people never expect. The moment you stop trying to manage the narcissist is the moment they lose power over you. Not because they change, but because you do. Self-authority is not loud. It does not argue. It does not announce itself. It simply chooses, again and again, to live from truth rather than tension. And that choice, made consistently, becomes freedom. What this story ultimately reveals is not the rise and fall of a relationship, but the quiet evolution of a person reclaiming themselves. At the beginning, the character believed that patience, understanding, and emotional endurance were signs of strength. They believed that if they just stayed calm enough, explained clearly enough, or loved deeply enough, balance would eventually be restored. What they didn't realize was that they were slowly giving up authorship of their own life. The journey unfolded in stages: confusion, self-doubt, exhaustion, clarity, grief, and finally, resolve. Each realization peeled away an illusion about fairness, about closure, about being seen. The most painful truth was also the most freeing. The chaos was never caused by a lack of effort, but by a dynamic that rewarded self-abandonment. Once that truth settled in, the story changed direction. Not through confrontation, not through revenge, but through withdrawal of emotional permission. The lesson is simple but demanding. Your well-being cannot be built on someone else's capacity to understand or value you. Real power begins when you stop negotiating your dignity. When you choose observation over explanation, boundaries over bargaining, and self-authority over approval. Your life reorients itself around something stable, your own values. Applied to everyday life, this lesson asks you to pause before over-explaining, to notice patterns instead of promises, and to measure relationships by how they make you feel consistently, not occasionally. It invites you to invest energy where it grows and to step back where it disappears. Most importantly, it reminds you that peace is not earned by endurance. It is chosen through clarity. Disclaimer: this video is for informational purposes only and shares knowledge. It is not a substitute for professional psychological diagnosis or therapy. Now, a quick question for you. A clarity is what finally brought me peace. A: I'm still waiting for someone else to change. Comment A or B below. What's your perspective on this topic? Have you experienced something similar? Or do you see it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your experience. And if this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful, empowering content in the videos ahead.